Hello and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, your host, and we are back to talk again about sustainable investing in environmental, social, and governance outcomes. New Day Impact Investing's Doug-Heske is back to continue that conversation. And what we are going to aim at today is how do you create a sustainable, circular, and equitable economy that we can hand to our children and grandchildren with a sense of pride. This week, we're looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is often shortened to DEI. And it's the idea that the dignity and value of every person must underlie a just society, or recognizing the dignity and value of every person. If we don't look these issues head on now, we may not end up with a sustainable economy in any sense. But even in the best case, it would be a society in which inescapable poverty and arbitrary judgments about the value of each person would make sustainability a hollow joke. Investors are increasingly factoring assessments of a company's DEI performance into their decisions. They recognize that hidden debts, whether that's the loss of economic value from excluding large swaths of the population from full participation in the economy, or what we are familiar with, the latent cost of environmental damage, can add up to and kill a company, and a market and a planet in the long run. Doug's team at New Day Impact has developed methodologies to identify companies that are making genuine progress on DEI issues, as well as companies that, similar to greenwashing, social wash their actual diversity and inclusion performance. That can make them a long-term investment risk, and you want to avoid that for a variety of reasons. Today, we're going to be discussing companies, including Lowe's companies. They're traded on the New York Stock Exchange under the symbol LOW. Apple, traded on the NASDAQ under APPL. Walgreens Boots Alliance, traded on the NASDAQ under WBA. And Adobe, which is also a NASDAQ stock, and the symbol is ADBE. We're also going to speak to Target, who we talked about last time as well. You can learn more about New Day Impact Investing and its CEO, Doug Heske, at newday-impact.com. New Day Impact is all one word, no dashes. Welcome back to the show, Doug. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, Mitch, and thanks for taking on what has been one of the most important social issues of not just our time, but literally for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's sometimes really hard to believe that it wasn't until 1972 that women were not afforded the same protective rights as men under the ERA. The consequences of all of this have been massive for our society, individuals and their families, but also businesses. Mm-hmm. To put it simply, it's been a lost opportunity for minority workers and their families and the companies that significantly limit their pool of skilled workers.
So let's start off by framing the bigger issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion. What is lost when an economy is not diverse, tolerant, and inclusive, and when there's a clear lack of equity? How much value are we just leaving on the table?
Yeah, so there are massive social and economic consequences of this. So lack of equity for minority populations exists at every level of our economic system, leading in part to what has become this enormous wealth gap, especially between Black, Hispanic, and white communities. So from our perspective, addressing this is our societal obligation. It is a critical step in supporting the future economic livelihoods of all minority communities. And fundamentally, improving diversity, equity, and inclusion is going to help us address social inequities and better equip Black and underserved individuals to build a stronger financial foundation for a more resilient future. Economic inclusion, in particular, would provide poor individuals and families with the opportunity to improve their standard of living. And lastly, and this point can't be emphasized too much, economic inclusion increases choices. Mm-hmm. Too often, Black and underserved individuals and families face limited choices based upon the lack of inclusion.
So how does New Day Impact define the populations that should be addressed by DEI efforts? How many people, for instance, live with disabilities? Does the concept of a minority in the United States even hold up when you look at the actual population demographics anymore? I mean, we're a big, diverse country, but we keep treating it as though there are certain people who are better.
That's correct. And this isn't a predicament that exists just here in the U.S., right, but it's global as well. Our definition, I think, is far broader than what most investment organizations that are focused on DEI encompass. So the groups that are included in our work as supporters of DEI are racial and ethnic groups, LGBTQ populations, persons with disabilities, and women, and even to a certain extent, immigrants and refugees. And so while these gaps that we were discussing just a moment ago are horrible for women and persons of color, they're even wider for LGBT communities and persons with disabilities. And I'd love to point out a couple of examples here because I think that these are just so incredibly striking. Almost 30% of bisexual women, trans people live in poverty today here in the US. And 1 in 5 LGBTQ individuals live below the poverty line, which remarkably is only $12,490. Right now, more than 1 billion people globally live with disabilities. This is about 20% of the world's population. And nearly 2/3 of the world's working age people with disabilities are not employed. So people with disabilities include people who are blind, deaf, physical, intellectual, and developmental disabilities as well, including mental disabilities like PTSD, anxiety, or depression. And that becomes a really, really important point given everything that we've been through with COVID as of late.
So when an investor's thinking about DEI, and perhaps for the first time, what are the benefits that they're going to gain as a result of factoring it into an investment decision?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me share, first of all, some personal perspectives. Mm-hmm. Since our company's inception, we have been very focused on building a diverse workforce at every level of our company. We are a diverse organization intent on building this force that represents the diverse nature of the world that we're serving, especially as an institutional asset management organization serving institutions all over the world. We are really proud of our own diversity statistics. And while we are a small and dynamic company, our workforce today is 75% diverse, represented by Black, Hispanic, women, and LGBTQ employees. Our board is 67% diverse, and our advisory board is 50% diverse. With that being said, and I want to be really clear about this, there's more work that we can be doing and more work that our communities can be doing in terms of the prioritization of the hiring of minorities.
So 67% on the board, for instance, is very high. What are you aspiring to reach in terms of both board representation and employee representation?
What our aspiration is to do is to have equal balance across all communities of individuals, whether it be at the board level, whether it be at the executive level, mid-management, across the entire organization. And this diversity, much like a lot of organizations, has brought to us a number of really important benefits. We have far better perspectives on the communities in which we are serving as a result of this diverse workforce. We've been able to attract customers that identify with a more diverse team. We have built this superior culture of belonging compared to, I think, other companies in our industry. Mm-hmm. And we have exponentially grown our talent pool. So just as an example, over the last 6 months, we have hired 2 really important women leaders to our company. The first is Shireen Edelblue, who joined us as an executive team member as the head of ESG research and chief diversity officer. The second, just over the last 12 days or so, was Ann Popkin, who joined us as president and chief operating officer. They're the leaders that we should be speaking to on this issue. And Ann, just over the last couple of weeks, has shared with many who we've spoken to her perspectives on the importance of DEI, repeatedly saying what respectable and healthy business in the world would ever limit their hiring pool to half of the population or less. Can you imagine saying that about your customers? But sadly, today, some do. So for us, it wasn't just about hiring the best person for the job, but the best person for the job that was a woman. And in this case, with both Shireen and Ann, we got both. And if you don't take that approach, things never change.
And the thing is, you can be representative, but if you also haven't created a culture where everybody has a voice, because you can say, oh, look, you can treat them like an audience with no voice and say, look, it's very diverse. But if you are not open to hearing all those opinions, that's also going to work against you. So this is much more than simply a numbers game. It's a numbers and culture or tolerance game that you have to build into the organization.
It absolutely is. And I think that there's a common mistake that's made in the corporate world today around how to build this sense or a culture of diversity, but more importantly, a culture of belonging. It's not about doing a 2-day training session. This is something that takes years to accomplish.
Yeah.
And, the one other thing that I would add is that, some of our world's most brilliant entrepreneurs and innovators have been persons with disabilities like Steve Jobs, Richard Branson, Elon Musk, women like Sheryl Sandberg, Oprah Winfrey, and Meg Whitman, immigrants like Jawed Karim, Jerry Yang, Sergey Brin. And I want to be very clear about something, that just because there are examples of minorities that have fought and found their way to success does not mean that those same opportunities have been afforded to all. So minority populations, it doesn't matter. Black, women, persons with disabilities have not had the same level of access to things like venture capital and equal employment opportunities and things like that.
Well, and in fact, in startups, you might have 2 or 3 startups before you actually have a success. And what I've seen over the course of 40 years of watching Silicon Valley is that it's strange. White men have a lot more opportunities to make mistakes, whereas those immigrants, if they didn't get a hit on their first attempt, may never get funded again.
Yeah, and these numbers are not close, by the way, and it depends upon the community, but certainly white men have by a factor of 10 to 15 stronger access, better access to venture monies and things like that. So it is something that we need to address today, and there are a number of really great organizations that are in the process of addressing that too, which is the good news.
So let's talk about some of the stocks that are in your various portfolios, but specifically around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And let's start with Target, who we spoke about the last time we met. And they're an example of one of the 5 examples of just a great company doing a good job at moving towards sustainable practices. But what is it about Target that makes it a DEI standout?
Yeah, so if I may, I'd like to just introduce some of these companies by first talking a bit about the evaluation process. This ends up becoming critically important given the era of greenwashing or social washing, as you had previously identified earlier. So we are looking at this long, vast array of data associated with DEI. And it's not just about organizations that are naming minorities to their executive ranks or board of directors. But what we really want to see is organizations that from the bottom up are making decisions that support that culture of diversity and belonging. Okay. So it's percentage of board members that have, as an example, a cultural background different from the location of the corporate headquarters. Mm-hmm. Does the company have a chief diversity officer who's a member of the executive committee? Another great metric that we look at is the number of controversies published in the media linked to workforce diversity and opportunity, like wages, promotion, discrimination, harassment, so that we consider any of these issues relating to discrimination and also whistleblower reports and things like that. Sure. Does the company have an employee resource group, which is voluntarily formed by a group of employees with common characteristics like ethnicity, sexual orientation, or disability status? So all of those things are really, really important. There are about 70 very specific things that we look for as at an organization, which is evidence that they're not just writing policy, but putting into practice these really, really important team items. So yes, we did speak about Target a couple of weeks ago, and Target is one of those real standouts. It is a portfolio holding in our DEI portfolio. They have an incredibly diverse workforce of about 350,000 team members. 50% of those team members are persons of color, More than 58% are women. Nearly half, or 42% of Target's leadership team is comprised of women. And out of that leadership team, 24% are persons of color. So really, really strong diversity characteristics across the board, very actively involved in the community and supporting community interests in the local communities in which they're living and operating in. And we are very excited about what the company has done, but not only that, where they're headed from here as well.
Well, in terms of where they're headed, they're right in the middle of their trading range over the course of the last year at $212 a share. Is it a good time to add Target to somebody's portfolio?
I don't think there's any question about that. They've certainly been a beneficiary of the COVID 19 environment where people have been staying home, nesting, applying capital resources into their home. And we think that that's going to continue to be the case as the economy continues to accelerate coming out of this very challenging period over the last few years.
Well, I suspect it's going to be challenging for a while. And these companies seem better positioned to respond to the many changes that we're going to be seeing, as well as, I believe, supply chain interruptions that'll be increasingly caused by climate change. Now, Lowe's is another standout. It's led by a Black CEO. It's been performing very well throughout the pandemic, rising from $66 when the market bottomed out in March 2020 to more than $230 today. How has Lowe's approach to its employee diversity made it a more resilient retailer during the pandemic and positioned it to go forward?
Yeah, so again, Lowe's has been a beneficiary of the same things that we were talking about regarding Target, but they are very committed to fostering what is an inclusive culture that enables everybody that's a part of the organization and everybody who touches their business to contribute to their success. The company is a big believer that diversity drives better ideas, positive business results, and establishes what is a strong connection into the communities in which they are serving. Some of the company's diversity and inclusion programs include associate-led business resources groups or partnerships with organizations such as executive leadership councils, where they focus on expanding the company's diverse supplier network. So Lowe's is also committed to improving their internal culture, diversity and inclusion in literally everything that they're doing. So they are making or have made multi-year efforts to integrate DE&I initiatives and programs into their corporate strategy, very much focused on diversity and inclusion in three areas around talent, culture, and then general business as well. Just this last year, they announced that 64% of their board were women and or ethnically diverse, and they are taking, I think, a lot of pride in moving the company forward on that effort. So they also are one of those organizations, as all of these companies are, in supporting what are really important, a really important focus on disabilities as well.
Well, and I think it's interesting, both Lowe's and Target also pay their associates quite well relative to the market. And this goes back all the way to the idea that Henry Ford pioneered, and Henry Ford had a lot of shortcomings, but he got this right. He paid people enough to buy the products that they made. And that seems that pay equity to the point that, we treat the poverty level in this country as a little over $12,000 a year in income. That's not enough to live for anybody.
No.
Are they going to see a lot of Target and Lowe's? Are they going to both face rising employment costs? And is this DEI approach going to help them deal with bringing along more people into economic participation?
I guess I would best answer that by saying, I hope so. Okay. And, we've been in a circumstance over the last decade or so where we've seen incredibly low wage growth. And that has had massive implications associated with the development of a strong middle class, right? That can't go on. Certainly can't go on any longer than it already has. And, I hope that Lowe's and Target, all of these organizations that we're talking about, and our legislators continue to take really strong action in terms of raising minimum wage so that workers continue to be beneficiaries of what's certainly been created here in the U.S. as historically anyway, as a really strong middle class.
Well, and a lot of people think of that as just a source of inflation, but in fact, an inflationary environment is actually good for stocks in most cases. So it's not the worst thing in the world for those costs to rise, as long as the business results follow along. And so it's. I agree with you. I hope that is how it turns out. Let's see. So let's turn to Apple. Led by the first openly gay Fortune 500 CEO, Tim Cook. It's also a creative powerhouse fueled by a very long-standing commitment to diversity and thinking differently. And this all goes back to Steve Jobs. Steve himself faced a lot of challenges in his life, but he made a company that reflected not his personality entirely, but a variety of personalities. I was there, I covered it. Now, Apple bottomed out when the pandemic began at about $57 a share, and it's been just climbing ever since, up to around $174, $75 as we speak. It's also become the first $3 trillion company ever for a few days. It's fallen back a bit. Tell us how Apple's practicing DEI every day.
So let's talk about it from a more general sense. So first and foremost, and I think I had shared this with you earlier, also reflected in your comments, that Steve Jobs, of course, was one of the greatest innovators of our time. Mm-hmm. And I think the organization continues to innovate, which is one of the reasons, obviously, why it continues to accelerate. Steve, in particular, was classified as a person of the disabled community because he had really, really bad dyslexia. So it's part of the reason I think that that he was intent on building what is this really, really diverse workforce. And I think largely behind, I think, the board's decision to appoint Cook as well. So they have made really important efforts to increase diversity internally, and currently more than 60% of their retail team members and more than 50% of retail leadership in the U.S. comes from underrepresented communities. So they're continuing to make really strong strides with their population of women, who represent about 35% of their global team members and 38% of global leadership. They're a big supporter of social justice programs and diversity programs. In fact, in 2020, they pledged $100 million as part of their racial justice and equity initiative that will go into these really important areas like this group of historical Black colleges and universities, Black-led startups, and innovation communities in majority Black areas. The other thing that I think would be important, again, for us to recognize is the work that they're doing on the disabilities side as well. So Apple, as an innovator, designs a wide variety of consumer electronics, also, including smartphones, tablets, and things like that. So the company is doing really, really strong work associated with accommodating applicants and employees with physical and mental disabilities. They've upgraded software features designed for people with mobility, vision, hearing, and cognitive disabilities, and products built with this wide array of features to support neurodiversity and cognitive disability. So, a really, really strong effort to give consideration to the disability community as well.
Well, and I think you're hitting on an incredibly important point. And I've seen this not only when I covered Apple back in the 80s and 90s, but also when I've worked at other technology companies, including Microsoft. By building accessible products, you expand your market. But you don't just expand them to the people with the disability you're seeking to address. A lot of other people end up using those features, and it drives a design ethos or aesthetic that produces a product that's really useful for more people. We forget that design, and you can see this in, for instance, the way AI bias is already being called out. You can build narrow products inadvertently, but this commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion creates a better product.
There's no question about that. And especially in this world now where there is a greater acceptance of people working remotely, the impact that that has on the disabled community potentially can be enormous, right? So, but we have to have corporate organizations give stronger consideration to people in the disabled community for employment purposes and things like that.
Well, and you and I have talked about this off the air a couple of times, but there are a lot of companies that gesture at this. Essentially, they check a box. They say, oh, we took care of that. Apple really seems to live this ethos. On the other hand, as we are speaking, there is coverage of Apple's treatment of its recent employee, well, actually all of its former employees. They reclassify them in a way that hides what they did at Apple. And it's, I think, the only company in the world doing this right now. Does that concern you as you look at Apple's future?
It does concern me. And I think that it's not just relative to the reclassification of job titles post people's departure, but there are a number of really important ballots that are up for consideration in this proxy voting season for Apple that we are in the process of delving into right now. What I would say, and you and I have talked about this for a long time relative to big corporate organizations, that a lot of these types of decisions are made to protect the interests of the organization also, and driven by, internal compliance, regulatory, and legal groups that may not be in the best interest of all of their stakeholders. So we are going to urge Apple to take different steps associated with not just the issue that you just addressed, but a variety of others as well. And, while they are doing really, really good work in some areas, this type of behavior, especially around reclassification, just can't continue.
Well, and I think you're also hitting on something that touches the general problem of transparency around environmental impacts that we have yet to really see the larger corporations embrace, and that is that their culture of confidentiality prevents them from talking about the fact that they are still on the journey toward a sustainable economy, rather than making promises about where they're going to be in 30 years. They need to be sharing that information today.
Yes, they do. And that doesn't go for just Apple, but all organizations need to become more transparent about this. It's what consumers are demanding today. And certainly from a regulatory standpoint, we're all aware of the scrutiny that's being placed by the Securities and Exchange Commission on organizations and on asset managers that are greenwashing or social washing today. So I think that it will only accelerate over the next 12 to 24 months as the Securities and Exchange Commission gets more deeply involved into disclosure issues.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing those changes. Let's turn to Walgreens Boots Alliance, another company on which you're extremely positive, but they haven't necessarily done so great during the pandemic. It was trading about $80 a share back in 2019, reached a low of $34 in October 2020, well after the pandemic lows, and then recovered to its current range, which is between $50 and $55. Yep. How does its DEI practices set the stage for continued growth as we exit, if we ever exit, the COVID era?
Yeah, so it's been a challenging period for Walgreens. They do have new leadership, and most importantly, their new leadership is under the direction of Rosalind Brewer, who is their new CEO, which we're very, very excited about. So the organization in recent years has made really important strides to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, and is continuing, especially under Rosalind's leadership, to push itself forward. At the start of fiscal 2019, they introduced what is the leadership accountability model, recognizing that change often starts at the uppermost levels of an organization, as we were talking about. I mean, this is about leadership. They have announced really important diversity and equity and inclusion performance goals to hold their leaders and executive level employees accountable for driving diverse representation across the entire organization and building this more inclusive culture. So in 2021, at the leadership level, they had announced that they want to see by the end of the fiscal year a 3% increase in women globally, achieving 42% representation across the organization. So it's not just about women leadership, but it's about building diversity across the board at the organization. So we're quite positive on the organization, although we view it as a turnaround situation. And we believe that under Rosalind Brewer's leadership, there are good things ahead for Walgreens.
Now, when we think about a large retail chain like Walgreens, a lot of people sort of think of it as background noise in the economy rather than driving the economy forward. Can Walgreens Boots Alliance use the diversity in its stores and in its leadership to begin to craft a more personalized local retail experience that's going to help transform the communities they operate in?
Yeah, so my sense is that they've already done that. Their presence in certain communities around the country is prolific. You don't have to drive very far to go pick up a prescription at Walgreens. And they've got a strong consumer retailing component in the business as well. So easy access is super, super important. And especially in this era where we have an aging population, in this era where we have a different level of importance around vaccinations and things like that, they have been kind of a go-to resource in delivering those solutions to the public.
So let's turn finally to Adobe. It's another tech company. They specialize in graphics and creative tools. The founders, again, who I knew back when I was at Mac Week and PC Week, were really fascinating people. They created an environment that welcomed diverse thinking and talent from around the world. The company is currently trading at around $510 to $515, but barely even hiccuped at the start of the pandemic.
Yeah.
But valuations tailed off after it touched about $688 a share in November 2021. So they're down pretty significantly. Are people underestimating Adobe's opportunity to grow as the new normal arrives?
I think so. I mean, Adobe, to your point, has consistently been a real standout in this area. They are in New Day's DEI portfolio because of their work to expand gender and racial equity across the organization. So in 2020, under a minority CEO, women represented 33.5% of Adobe's employees. Now, we want that to get stronger, but leadership ranks women in their leadership ranks was 26.1%. And then out of their new hiring across the company in fiscal year 2020, 37.7% of their new hires came from minority populations. So there's a really, really good characteristics associated with diversity. With respect to racial progress, Adobe has also launched a number of really important programs, like their Taking Action initiative, they call it TIA, to accelerate the representation, development, and success of Adobe's Black employees. We also want them to continue to increase their Black representation across their employee and leadership ranks going forward. So I think that they will continue to be a leader. I think that this is something that is really, really important to their Chief Executive Officer, Shantanu Narayan. And, we're very, very positive on the organization going forward. One of the things that we also look at with every one of these companies is the awards that they receive every year for the diversity characteristics. So, certainly Adobe is no stranger to that. In 2021, they were a part of the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. Just Capital and Forbes listed them as one of 2021's most admired companies. And there are a long list of other accreditations that they have, including being named one of the 100 best corporate citizens in the country as well for LGBTQ communities.
And as companies take off the blinders by looking through the eyes of a much more diverse workforce, it opens a lot of opportunities. And Adobe, I think, is interesting in terms of its ability to support this new world of remote and creative work that we're moving into, where a lot of the value add is what many years ago was described as the work of symbolic analysts and interpretive work, creative work. Do you see, where do you see Adobe's product set going as you think about they're applying the lessons from their DEI investments?
That's a great question. So, I mean, this is an example, but Adobe is continuing to work in building accessibility into its products and raising awareness with teams across the company using what we understand to be as Adobe's common controls framework for accessibility. This is in the disabilities area. Mm-hmm. In its product lineup, Adobe helps address this need of both users with disabilities and authors of accessible content. So using things like Acrobat Pro and Acrobat Standard, virtually anyone can create an accessible PDF document that can be used using those tools. So this helps users with disabilities more easily access through this program PDF files and other forms across multiple languages. So this is the type of thing that we're looking for in terms of not just policy or statements from an organization, but what specifically are they doing to support communities like the disabled.
So I want to close out with a question, which is to look forward. What differences are we not currently addressing that we should consider as we evolve a new economy and build it on renewable energy and sustainable manufacturing? Are there other forms of misrepresentation that we need to address?
Yeah, that is such a great question. So as we know, the core of American success has been built around innovation and entrepreneurship. And many recent innovations have become available at a time where the need for greater inclusion is really clearer than ever today. So our workforce is becoming more diverse, it's becoming more global, it is more focused on sustainability. And younger workers in particular seem better skilled today than any other generation. And they are working on what I classify as sort of these change the world projects. So like we've worked with interns over the last couple of years from a number of domestic and international universities that have just been, powerfully skilled on the jobs of tomorrow. So the development of a more global skilled workforce is an imperative. And we at New Day are soon going to be launching and announcing a partnership with Generation Unlimited, which is part of UNICEF. It's a public-private partnership committed to youth skills development for the jobs of tomorrow. And I think that one of the most important things that corporate organizations can do today is deploying capital into solutions for the future of work. And this is what Generation Unlimited is doing. So as an example, funding capital into early stage companies, nonprofit, social enterprises around the world today can change opportunities for members of all of our minority communities. Particularly, it's really, really important for the disabled communities today. So I think that, to your earlier point, Mitch, that we need to fix the system. And this is a critical role for investors today. And scaling this change is really going to require a bold and visionary mindset. It's not about fixing the symptoms of these problems. It's about fixing the system. So, we will, as a society, a domestic society and a global society, not have arrived at a better place until there is much better diversity, equity, and inclusion with far less economic consequences. So it really demands a very different approach today.
Well, Doug, I want to thank you, as always, for a fascinating conversation. I look forward to the next one.
Thank you, Mitch. This is really, really important to our communities and certainly to New Day as well. So thank you again for addressing what's a critically important topic.
Well, onward and upward. We've been talking with Doug Heske. He's the CEO of New Day Impact Investing. And of course, they manage sustainable investing portfolios. We encourage you to take a look at them at newday-impact.com. That's all one word, newday-impact.com. You know, folks, as Doug said, if you have a vision for the future, you can use your investments as well as the things you buy by giving your money to different companies to achieve outcomes that reach far beyond pure economic impact that can have, well, you know, a much more interesting range of influences on the future of our planet. When we look past profit to environmental and socioeconomic impact, you see that all of the organizations, government, private, nonprofits, all of them, for-profits as well, are able to change the world around us, and we can help direct that by putting our money behind the companies that we believe are going to do a good job. This is Earth911 Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, and we are, of course, going to be back soon with another innovator interview. But in the meantime, I hope you'll share this podcast as well as many of the others that we've done and any other podcasts that deal with these questions with your friends and your family and strangers on the street. It's important we get more ideas out there so there's less waste and more opportunity for all of us. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, your host, and we're going to be back soon. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.